I wouldn't have said so, no. Not really. But no, I don't get the feeling that she's wildly optimistic about life. A pragmatist, I think.
The ceremony was meant to be flawless. Every chair had been placed, every guest had been seated, and every royal face had been trained into perfect calm. Then Princess Anne saw the tiara. Not just any tiara, Diana's tiara, resting on Camilla's head under the lights of a crown ceremony. In one frozen second, tradition cracked, silence spread, and Anne made the decision no one expected. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not flinch. She fixed her eyes on the jewel as if the room had suddenly vanished around her, and the meaning of that single object struck harder than any speech could have done. The crown ceremony, a formal royal event meant to honor duty, rank, and the public image of unity, had been arranged to show the family standing together. Charles was there to hold the center. Camilla was there to be seen beside him. William and Catherine were there because the future of the monarchy had to look steady. And Anne was there because the old guard still mattered. But the moment Diana's tiara appeared on Camilla's head, the entire purpose of the ceremony changed. Camilla felt it before anyone spoke. The queen consort's face tightened as Anne's stare became impossible to ignore, and what had begun as a mark of royal status suddenly became a spotlight of shame. She had entered that room expecting dignity, perhaps even acceptance. Instead, she found herself trapped beneath a symbol that belonged to someone the public had never stopped mourning. Charles noticed the shift too. The king turned slightly toward his sister, and his expression hardened because he understood what Anne had seen. This was not a small mistake. This was a wound, placed in full view. William leaned closer to Catherine and whispered only a few words, but the prince's restraint carried more force than anger. Catherine kept her gaze on the tiara, her face pale with the shock of seeing Diana's memory pulled into a ceremony that was supposed to calm the family, not reopen its deepest pain. The future king did not move, but his silence said everything. He was watching his mother's legacy become a test of power. Anne stepped forward. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. A senior aide moved toward Charles, but the monarch stayed still, caught between his wife, his sister, and the memory no crown could command. Then Anne spoke with cold control. The ceremony could not continue until Diana's tiara was removed. And with that, the palace understood the truth. Anne's objection was not just about jewels, it was about Diana, memory, power, and the people who still carried wounds the palace never healed. Inside that room, nobody was merely watching. Each royal carried a private history into the moment Anne spoke. Charles saw a ceremony slipping out of his hands. Camilla felt the room turn cold around her. William heard his mother's name without anyone saying it. Catherine understood instantly that this was no fashion mistake, and Anne, standing like a blade in the silence, knew exactly what she had just done. Charles had approved the ceremony because he wanted control, peace, and one clean image of unity after months of private tension. The crown ceremony, a formal royal event meant to show honor, rank, and public duty, was supposed to prove that the family could still stand together without fracture. The king believed every detail had been checked before anyone entered the room. Camilla believed the same. But now the queen consort sat beneath Diana's tiara, and that single jewel had become louder than every planned word. Anne felt anger rise, but she held it tightly. She knew royal boundaries were not just rules written in quiet offices. They were lines drawn around memory, pain, and respect. Diana's tiara mattered because it carried a story the public had never released, and William had never forgotten. The prince stood still, fighting the pull between discipline and grief, because one wrong reaction could turn a family wound into a national storm. Catherine saw that fight in him. She watched his face harden, then soften, then close completely. Camilla's confidence began to crack. The queen consort had entered that room, expecting the ceremony to lift her standing. But Anne's stare changed everything. She suddenly understood that the tiara was not being seen as honor. It was being seen as possession. Catherine noticed the panic first. The small change in Camilla's mouth. The sharp stillness in her shoulders. Anne noticed too, but she did not soften. She knew that if she stepped back now, the message would be clear. Diana's memory could be used whenever the palace needed beauty, drama, or silence. Charles turned toward a senior aide and asked one quiet question. Who authorized the tiara? The aide did not answer at once, and that pause became its own confession. The king's face tightened, because hesitation meant there was a trail. Anne understood it before anyone said it. William understood it too. Somewhere before this ceremony, someone had placed Diana's tiara onto the approved regalia list, the official record of jewels and items cleared for royal use during formal events. That discovery changed the air. Camilla was no longer just wearing the tiara. Someone had made sure she could. And to understand why Anne reacted so fiercely, the story had to go back to the single private moment that made this confrontation unavoidable. Weeks before the crown ceremony, there had been another room, another table, and another silence. It happened during a private family dinner at Windsor, when Camilla made one remark about Diana's place in royal memory. The words were soft, almost casual, but they landed like a match dropped onto dry paper. Anne heard them. William heard them. Catherine saw his face change. And from that night onward, nothing was the same. Camilla had spoken as if she were discussing order, not pain. She said Diana's symbols should no longer be treated as untouchable during future royal ceremonies, and the room fell into a silence that felt dangerous. The private family dinner at Windsor mattered because it was not public duty. It was family. No cameras, no crowd, no official smiles. A royal ceremony, in simple terms, is a formal event where the family uses crowns, jewels, and ritual to show power and continuity. But Camilla's words made Anne understand that some people inside the palace were already thinking about Diana's memory as something that could be moved, used, and reassigned. Anne reacted first. She did not raise her voice, but the warning in it was sharp enough to cut through the table. She told Camilla that some symbols did not belong to palace convenience. They belonged to national memory, and more than that, they belonged to family grief. Camilla looked back at her, wounded and defensive, but Anne did not soften. The Princess Royal knew exactly why the remark mattered. If Diana's legacy could be treated as a ceremonial tool, then William's pain could be treated as a detail. And that was the line Anne refused to let anyone cross. William said nothing. The prince gripped his glass and refused to look across the table for several long minutes. Catherine noticed the change in him immediately. She placed her hand near his arm, not to stop him, but to remind him he was not alone. The future king carried the discipline of the crown on his shoulders. But Diana was not just history to him. She was his mother. Catherine understood that difference, and Camilla's remark had touched the one wound that royal training could never fully hide. Charles tried to save the dinner. The king shifted the conversation toward ceremony dates, seating, and protocol, hoping the family would move away from the danger before it grew sharper. Protocol, in plain words, means the set of royal rules that decides how events are arranged and how people are expected to behave. But Anne noticed what mattered most. Charles changed the subject, yet he did not correct Camilla. He did not say Diana's symbols were off limits. He did not draw the boundary. Anne remembered that silence later, when a courtier amended the regalia notes. The regalia notes were the official list of jewels and royal items approved for use during formal events. Diana's tiara appeared there under the phrase, symbolic continuity, a cold phrase that made grief sound useful. A documented palace account later showed the change had been made after the Windsor dinner, not before it. Anne read it, closed the file, and understood the path had already been cleared. Anne went privately to Charles that same evening and told him plainly that if the tiara appeared at the ceremony, she would not remain silent. The king looked tired, but she did not let him look away. Camilla had made the remark. William had heard it. Catherine had seen the damage. And Anne had drawn the line before anyone else dared to draw it. So when the jewel finally appeared in public, Anne was not surprised she was ready. The room did not erupt. It froze. That was worse. Anne did not shout, and that made her more terrifying. She crossed the space with measured steps, every movement cutting through protocol like a warning. Camilla remained seated for a second too long. Charles looked toward his sister with the expression of a man watching control slip from his hands. Then Anne stopped directly before them and forced the hidden conflict into the open. Anne looked straight at Camilla and asked who approved Diana's tiara for the ceremony. The question landed hard because it did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like accusation. Camilla's lips parted, but no answer came at first. The queen consort had expected discomfort, perhaps even whispers, but not this. The ceremony had become a public confrontation, and that mattered because royal events are built on control. Protocol, in simple words, means the rules that decide how royals behave, move, speak, and respond in formal moments. Anne had just broken that calm on purpose. Charles tried to stop the damage before it spread. He gave Anne a quiet command, telling her to step back and allow the matter to be handled privately. But the Princess Royal did not move. She kept her hand near the back of a chair, steady and controlled, making it clear that the ceremony would remain halted until the question was answered. The king understood the danger immediately. If Anne backed down, Camilla would remain protected. If Anne refused, the whole room would know the palace had crossed a line. Camilla finally spoke, and her voice carried more fear than strength. She insisted the tiara had been presented as part of the approved ceremonial collection, not as a personal provocation. A ceremonial collection means the jewels, items, and objects selected for use during a royal event. But her explanation made William's jaw tighten. To him, Diana's memory had just been reduced to paperwork. Catherine watched the prince carefully, seeing the grief he fought to hide. She knew he could not defend his mother without turning the moment into something even bigger. Anne heard Camilla's answer and grew colder. She was not satisfied, because the queen consort's words pointed to a deeper problem. If the tiara had been approved, then someone had approved it. If someone had approved it, then Diana's memory had been moved through the palace system like an object on a list. Anne turned toward the senior aide, and the room followed her gaze. The aide looked at Charles, then at the floor, and that hesitation became the second blow. Charles demanded the truth. The aide admitted the final regalia sheet had been altered after the Windsor dinner. A regalia sheet is the formal list of royal jewels and symbols cleared for a ceremony, and this one now carried Diana's tiara as if it belonged there. The king turned sharply toward his staff, anger cutting through his usual restraint. Camilla sat still, wounded by the admission. William looked away, while Catherine stayed close enough for him to feel her support without a word. Anne delivered the line that changed everything. No crown ceremony could continue while Diana's memory was being used without family consent. Charles did not answer at once. Camilla lowered her gaze. William breathed slowly, fighting the pain behind his silence. Catherine understood that Anne had done more than stop a ceremony. She had exposed the question everyone had avoided. But the confrontation revealed something even more dangerous. The real issue was not who wore the tiara, but who still had the power to decide what Diana's legacy meant. Power in a royal room does not always roar. Sometimes it lowers its voice. Charles finally moved, and every person present felt the shift. He did not defend Camilla at once. He did not rebuke Anne at once. He simply asked for the amended regalia file. That single request changed the balance of the room, because suddenly the ceremony was no longer about spectacle. It was about authority. Charles held out his hand, and the silence around him became sharper. The regalia file, in simple words, was the official folder listing which royal jewels and ceremonial items had been approved for use that day. The king wanted it brought forward immediately because Anne's challenge had turned one jewel into a test of judgment. If he ignored his sister, he would look careless with Diana's memory. If he defended Camilla too quickly, he would look blind to William's pain. The monarch understood that every second now carried consequences. Camilla felt the distance before Charles said another word. The queen consort had expected him to protect her first, to calm the room, to draw attention away from the tiara and back toward the ceremony. Instead, he asked for the file. That hurt her more than Anne's stare. She sat with her hands still, realizing that crown duty had stepped between husband and wife. Charles did not look cruel. He looked trapped, and that made the wound deeper, because Camilla could see he was choosing the institution before comfort. Anne watched the file arrive, but she did not relax. The Princess Royal felt vindicated, yet tension stayed locked in her face, because Charles had not made his final choice. He could still bury the matter behind polite words. He could still call it a misunderstanding. He could still protect unity at the cost of truth. Anne knew the palace had survived many storms by softening hard facts, but this storm touched Diana, and Diana's name still had the power to shake every wall around them. William stepped closer to Catherine and spoke low enough that only she heard him clearly. Diana's name could not be borrowed whenever the palace needed symbolism. The prince's words carried years of pain, not anger alone. Catherine looked at him with quiet concern, knowing he was fighting to remain controlled while his mother's memory was being handled like a royal object. The future king did not need to raise his voice. His restraint was the proof of how much the moment cost him. Charles opened the file and read the altered note. He stopped at the phrase that had caused it all, then set the papers down without speaking. The king looked first at Anne, then at Camilla, and the order of that glance told the room everything. Anne had forced accountability into the open. Camilla had been left standing inside the consequence. Charles understood now that the issue was not only who wore the tiara, it was who had dared to approve it without facing the family it would hurt. The ruling came with calm force. Charles declared that the ceremony would remain suspended, while Diana's tiara was removed, and the authorization was traced. Camilla lowered her eyes, wounded by the public weight of those words. Anne stayed still, firm but not triumphant. William stood beside Catherine, breathing through the grief he refused to show. The king had not ended the crisis. He had only named it. That decision did not calm the palace. It ignited the first wave of consequences. The most powerful moment came without a speech. Camilla lifted her hands toward the tiara, and for the first time that day, the room saw the queen consort not as a figure of ceremony, but as a woman cornered by memory. The jewel came away slowly. No applause followed. No music returned. Only the silence remained, thick with everything no one dared say. Camilla did not look at Anne as her fingers reached the tiara. She kept her face forward, but the queen consort knew every person in the room was watching the same painful act. Diana's tiara had become the first visible consequence of Anne's intervention. And that mattered, because royal symbols are never just decoration. A tiara, in plain words, is a jeweled headpiece worn at formal royal events to show rank, history, and ceremonial honor. But this one carried grief. This one carried Diana, and now Camilla had to remove it in front of everyone. Charles watched without expression. The king gave nothing away, yet his stillness revealed the strain inside him. He had chosen royal judgment over immediate personal protection, and that choice left Camilla exposed. The ceremony had been designed to show unity, but now it showed division with brutal clarity. Charles understood that if he rushed to comfort her, He would appear to dismiss Anne's warning. If he stood coldly apart, he would deepen the wound in his own marriage. So he stayed still, and that stillness hurt everyone. Camilla felt the humiliation settle around her. The queen consort had entered the room hoping the jewel would mark acceptance. But the ceremony had turned her into the symbol of a boundary crossed. Her hands lowered with the tiara, and the silence made the act feel heavier than any public rebuke. Anne watched closely, but the Princess Royal did not look pleased. She looked grim. She knew she had protected Diana's memory, but she had also wounded the family in front of the very people they were meant to reassure. William lowered his gaze as the tiara was taken away. The prince was not celebrating. He was grieving. Diana's memory had been pulled into a struggle for place, approval, and power. And that made the moment feel less like justice and more like loss. Catherine quietly followed the jewel with her eyes, understanding that nothing about this would stay private now. She knew the monarchy had crossed into a reckoning, and William's silence told her he knew it too. Charles finally moved to end the public damage. He ordered the guests to be taken to a private reception, while the family remained behind for further discussion. A private reception means a controlled gathering away from the main ceremony, used to keep guests occupied while sensitive matters are handled elsewhere. Camilla heard the order and understood that the ceremony was no longer hers to recover. Anne remained firm. William stayed close to Catherine. The king looked toward the closed doors and knew the hardest part had only begun. Behind those closed doors, the ceremony disappeared, and the family finally had to speak without protocol protecting them. When the doors closed, the palace changed shape. No aides, no music, no ceremonial language, just family. Anne stood near the table, still rigid with resolve. Camilla sat apart, pale and wounded. Charles remained between them, like a man split by duty. William finally spoke, and his voice was quieter than anyone expected. That quietness cut deeper than anger ever could. Charles dismissed every aide with one firm order, and the room lost its shield. No one could hide behind procedure now. An aide, in simple words, is a trusted royal staff member who helps manage schedules, messages, and private arrangements. Without them present, the family had no buffer, no careful language, no one to soften the truth before it reached the person it would hurt. The king knew that mattered, because this was no longer just about a ceremony. It was about whether the family could admit that Diana's memory had been handled like property. William looked at Camilla and finally said what the room had been avoiding. Diana's memory could not be folded into ceremony without the family understanding what it cost. The prince did not shout. That made it worse. His grief came through in the control, in the careful way he chose each word. Camilla looked wounded, but she listened. The queen consort had wanted recognition, but now she was hearing what that recognition had taken from someone else. Catherine stayed close to William, quiet but steady, because she knew his pain was not public performance. It was personal. Camilla answered with hurt in her voice. She said she never meant to mock Diana, never meant to turn the tiara into a weapon, never meant to humiliate anyone. But then the truth slipped out. The queen consort admitted she had accepted the jewel because she wanted to feel fully recognized inside a family that had never completely opened its heart to her. That admission changed the room. Anne heard it and did not soften. She understood the pain, but she would not excuse the choice. Anne spoke with cold honesty. Recognition built on another woman's grief would never look like honor. The Princess Royal told Camilla that some symbols carried lives inside them, and Diana's tiara was one of them. Charles listened without interrupting. The king knew Anne was right, but he also saw Camilla's humiliation clearly. That was the cruelty of the moment. No one had escaped untouched. Catherine finally turned to Charles and spoke gently, but every word carried weight. She told him the monarchy had to protect memory as carefully as it protected crowns. The monarchy, in simple terms, is the royal system built around the king, his family, and the traditions that connect them to the country. Catherine understood that if the crown treated pain as decoration, people would stop believing in its dignity. William looked toward her, grateful but still wounded. Charles lowered his gaze and acknowledged the failure. The approval process had ignored emotional truth in favor of symbolic theater. The king admitted that Diana's memory had been placed into ceremony without enough care, and Camilla knew what that meant before he finished. She agreed the tiara should be withdrawn permanently from any ceremony connected to her role. By the time the doors opened again, the palace had made its decision, but outside, the world had already begun writing its own judgment. By morning, the image had escaped the palace walls, not the full ceremony, not the private argument, just one unforgettable frame. Camilla seated beneath the lights, wearing Diana's tiara, and Anne standing nearby with a face carved from fury. Britain did not need the full transcript. The picture told the story, and once the public saw it, the crown could no longer control the meaning. Charles moved quickly, but the damage had already outrun him. The palace released a controlled statement, confirming that the ceremony had been paused because of a regalia review. A regalia review, in simple words, means officials were checking whether a royal jewel or ceremonial item had been properly approved for use. The wording sounded calm, careful, and official. But that was the problem. The public did not want polished language. They wanted truth. Diana's tiara had appeared on Camilla's head. Anne had stopped the room, and no soft phrase could make that look ordinary. Camilla watched the coverage alone, and every headline felt like another door closing. The queen consort had hoped the night's private decision would keep the wound contained, but the image had already become a national symbol. She saw herself described not as honored, but as overreaching. That cut deeply, because the same jewel she believed might bring recognition had instead turned her into the center of public anger. Camilla understood then that the people had not seen a royal gesture. They had seen Diana's memory being touched without permission. William saw the London newspaper front page before breakfast. The headline was brutal in its simplicity. Anne said no. Beneath it, Camilla appeared under Diana's tiara, while Anne stood near her with a face that needed no explanation. The prince folded the paper slowly and told Catherine that Anne had done what others were too afraid to do. Catherine listened quietly, knowing his words carried relief and sadness together. The future king was grateful the boundary had been defended, but the fact it needed defending at all still hurt. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace, leaving white flowers and handwritten cards that mentioned Diana by name. Kensington Palace, in plain words, is the royal residence strongly linked to Diana's public life and memory, which made the gathering feel personal rather than political. Some cards thanked Anne. Others simply said Diana had not been forgotten. The flowers mattered because they showed the palace that this was not just media noise. It was memory rising from the public heart. A broadcaster gave the moment its final shape on morning television. He called it the day Princess Anne defended the line between remembrance and replacement, and the phrase spread fast. Anne did not give an interview. She did not need one. The image had become her statement. Camilla, still shaken, heard the words and understood that the public had made its judgment before the family had even finished its own. Charles prepared the final family statement with a heavy face. The king knew this statement would decide whether the monarchy looked broken or morally clear. He could protect Camilla from further shame, or he could protect the boundary Anne had forced into the open. William waited with Catherine. Camilla waited alone. Anne waited without apology. And when the verdict finally came, it did not arrive as punishment, it arrived as a boundary. The final decision was not loud. It did not need to be. Charles confirmed that Diana's tiara would be withdrawn from Camilla's ceremonial use, and that future regalia, tied to personal legacy, would require family agreement before appearing in crown events. Anne had halted a ceremony, But the monarchy now understood she had done something larger. She had forced the crown to remember that symbols have souls. Charles delivered the ruling with a voice that carried no anger, only weight. Diana's tiara would not be worn by Camilla at any future crown ceremony, and emotionally sensitive royal items would require direct family approval before use. Regalia, in simple words, means the crowns, jewels, and ceremonial objects used to show royal history, rank, and duty. The king made the rule clear because this crisis had proved one painful truth. A jewel could not be treated as harmless when it carried a life, a memory, and a wound the nation still understood. Charles framed the decision carefully. He did not call it a punishment. He called it a correction of judgment and a protection of legacy. The king knew Camilla had already suffered public humiliation, and he did not want the final statement to sound like a personal attack. But he also knew Anne had been right. If the monarchy ignored Diana's emotional place in the family, it would look cold, careless, and hungry for symbols it had not earned. The monarch had to choose clarity, even when clarity hurt. Anne felt the weight of that choice more than anyone expected. The Princess Royal had protected Diana's memory, but she had also forced the family through a reckoning that left bruises on every side. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. Anne understood that victory inside a family often feels like grief wearing armor. She had stopped the ceremony, yes, but she had also exposed how easily the palace could confuse inheritance with possession. Camilla accepted the ruling with visible sadness. The queen consort understood now that recognition could not be demanded from symbols the public still linked to another woman's pain. She had wanted the tiara to make her feel secure, accepted, and permanent. Instead, it reminded everyone that some spaces in royal memory cannot be occupied by force. Camilla's silence became her acceptance, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that dignity sometimes begins by stepping back. William found quiet closure in the decision, though the wound did not disappear. The prince was not healed by a ruling, and Diana's memory could never be reduced to one jewel. But the boundary had finally been named. Catherine stood beside him with calm strength, seeing the verdict as a rare moment when the monarchy chose emotional truth over polished appearance. She knew that mattered because public trust is not built only on crowns. It is built on whether people believe the family still understands pain. Charles looked across the room and saw what the ceremony had become. Anne had not broken it. Camilla had not survived it untouched. William had not forgotten. Catherine had not looked away. The king understood the final lesson with painful clarity. The crown could inherit jewels, houses, titles, and duties, but it could not simply claim the soul attached to them. There was no unresolved mystery left in that room. The tiara was removed. The boundary was drawn. Anne's intervention did not destroy the crown ceremony, it saved the monarchy from confusing inheritance with possession. And Diana's memory, at last, could not be worn into silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.